Hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to talk about boundaries. So we can define boundaries as the dividing line between two different things. So in terms of people and psychology, this is the boundary between two people. A firm boundary means that there is respect for others and the self and the beliefs, ideas, opinions, likes, dislikes, and wants and needs of all parties. And a psychologically healthy person is aware that they do not have rights or ownership over another, and healthy boundaries create mutual trust. So this is what a boundary is. And when we come from a narcissistic family, we tend to have no boundaries and maybe no idea of what a boundary even is, because we'll suppress that into our subconscious, that need for boundaries and the knowledge of what they are to survive the situation that we're in. Because a definition actually of that kind of abusive, dysfunctional relationship can be that porous boundaries, being overwhelmed by someone else, being dominated by someone else, being coerced by someone else. And this can't happen if there are healthy boundaries in place. So we can think of growing up in a narcissistic household as having those things attacked specifically so that you can be controlled as a child in that family, because it's about power and control in a narcissistic family and not being allowed to have a boundary. So people in adulthood then, when they come from a narcissistic family, struggle with setting boundaries. So this means they struggle with saying no, they struggle with having their own ideas, feeling firm in their own opinions, having a strong sense of self. They may over-identify with other people. That means that when they're talking to someone, they kind of become absorbed in that person and really agree with that person and what they're talking about. And then when they've been away from that person for an hour or a day or so, they might think, actually, I don't agree with that, and I think this is what I think. So this is the effect that narcissistic parents can have on their children. They're trained to not have boundaries, to not assert their wants and needs, and it's a mess psychologically. So we can think of it then, the child's natural desire to set the boundaries and the parents' pushback against those boundaries means that it's in essence a state of psychological warfare. So I've been reading a book called The Rape of the Mind by Joost Meerloo, who was born in 1903 at The Hague in the Netherlands. He was educated there. He went to university, earned a PhD, served as teacher and staff psychiatrist at several hospitals, entered into private practice in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis at The Hague, and also served as psychiatric consultant to the Royal Court and to governmental agencies. Under the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, Dr. Meerloo was able to observe at first hand the methods of mental torture and forced interrogation described in this book. In 1942, he narrowly missed death at the hands of the German occupation forces in the Netherlands and escaped to England, where he served as a colonel, chief of the psychological department of the Netherlands Army. For 2 years before he came to the United States in 1946, he was High Commissioner for Welfare for the Netherlands government. He was decorated with a Distinguished Service Cross in 1943. Since settling in New York, he has taught in several schools and conducted the private practice of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and became a citizen of the United States in 1950. He's an honorary member and fellow of several professional societies. He's written 13 books. He's distinguished editor, well-known book reviewer. This Rape of the Mind is his 14th book, and it draws upon his experiences and intimate knowledge of what extreme mental pressure can do to the human mind. And he died in 1976. And what's so interesting about his book is that it's comparable to growing up in a narcissistic family. So we can think of the narcissist as a totalitarian leader. We can imagine the metaphor of countries. So the narcissist is a country and their children are a country, their child is a country, and they want to invade that country, occupy it, take it over, be in control. They have no respect for that country's boundaries. They will use any weapon necessary, any means necessary to occupy that country and dominate that country. And then once that country's dominated, which is quite easy to dominate and coerce and control a child, then they are a totalitarian government in charge and they behave in that way. So our mind, then, we can kind of see it as a bit war-torn. It's been in the wars, it's been under psychological warfare, or emotional warfare would be a better description. And then you're going to come out with the consequences of that. So I want to cover all of this in the video. I want to talk all about boundaries, go a bit more in depth and look at what porous boundaries look like, what rigid boundaries look like. Read some quotes from this book as well, which tie in with coming from a narcissistic family, and also look at what healthy boundaries look like, the struggle to get there. This is what healing is actually. It's coming from having no boundaries and that state of emotional warfare, your inner mind being like a war-torn country, and your recovery from that and getting to a place where you are healed, your buildings are rebuilt, your boundaries are firmed up around your country, and you can defend that country. You can be assertive and defend that country. Because what happens when we have no boundaries is we're very people-pleasing. We find it really difficult to be assertive. We tend to avoid people and duck out of situations rather than stand up for ourselves, for example. So let's have a look at boundaries. So as I said, healthy boundaries mean there's a healthy barrier between two people. So if we imagine it in the metaphor of countries, you go to visit France, you enjoy their croissants. You go to visit Italy, you enjoy their pizza. And Italy is not in there shouting at the French that they should be eating pizza and their croissants are horrible. So it's a basic respect for the ideas, beliefs, customs, likes, dislikes, all those things. So let's have a look at traits of rigid and porous boundaries, and then we'll have a look at what healthy boundaries might look like. So traits of rigid boundaries are that people avoid intimacy and close relationships. They're unlikely to ask for help. They're really guarded about personal information, especially things they feel ashamed about, because people who've come from narcissistic families tend to carry a lot of shame. They might seem detached or aloof, and people might comment that they seem snobby or distant. They might have that kind of comment about them. And they have very strong fears of abandonment, so they tend to keep people away from them or reject people first because it's less painful than being rejected. And they're hypervigilant for signs of being rejected by other people as well. So rejection can be a comment or a look, or not being able to answer your phone call, or not answering an email really quickly. Things like this that can be perceived with our hypervigilant bias that we're being rejected by people. Then if we have porous boundaries, this can look like oversharing personal information. So this is telling too much to the inappropriate people. So oversharing with work colleagues, for example. It can look like a difficulty in saying no to others. So you just can't say no. You just agree to go along with whatever people ask of you. It can mean that you're dependent on the opinions of others. So you shape your own opinions by what other people think. You accept people treating you badly because you think you deserve it, because it looks very familiar to what you went through in childhood. And then you fear rejection if you don't comply with others. So this is, again, that fear of abandonment. So if I don't go along with what other people want me to do, then they're going to reject me, they're going to abandon me. And this is going to be an ingrained core belief in a child of a narcissist. So what do healthy boundaries look like? This means we value our own opinions and we value the opinions of others. We don't compromise our values for other people. So we know what our values are, we know what our morals are, and we're not going to go against them to please somebody else. We share information in an appropriate way, so we give out the right information to people close to us and the right amount of information to work colleagues, for example, not over or under sharing. We're aware of our own personal wants and needs, and we can tell other people what they are, which is really important. And we can say no to others and they can say no to us, and we don't feel like it's a rejection There's that mutual trust and respect there between people. And there are different boundary types as well. So we have emotional boundaries. This refers to our feelings. Healthy emotional boundaries involve an awareness of when to share and when not to share personal information. Time boundaries refer to how we use our time. Healthy time boundaries mean a person sets aside enough time for each area of their life. So we work for an appropriate amount of time, we socialise for an appropriate amount of time, we spend time on our own for an appropriate amount of time. Physical boundaries refer to personal space and physical touch. Physical boundaries may be violated if someone touches you and it is unwanted. Intellectual boundaries refer to thoughts and ideas, and healthy intellectual boundaries include respect for the ideas of other people and what it is appropriate to talk about. And material boundaries refer to money and possessions. Healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you share with others. So a few examples of unhealthy boundaries might be loaning money to people when you can't afford to, finding it hard to say no, offering unsolicited advice to people, doing things that you do not like, being codependent, not having enough time for yourself, letting people hurt you, ignoring red flags, oversharing information about yourself, allowing others to say things to you which you know are wrong or disrespectful and feeling unable to speak up for yourself, and feeling obligated to do what others want you to do. What all these things helped you to do in childhood was to survive in a hostile environment that you found yourself in. But many people have a kind of a love-hate relationship with these parts of themselves, so that it feels comfortable to be doing these behaviours. But then also we can really be annoyed with ourselves or angry with ourselves because we can't say no and we don't stand up for ourselves. And then sometimes we can feel angry with the other person for asking us to do something because we can't say no. So it's quite interesting how it can work. So this blurring of the boundaries can be called enmeshment. So this is literally being enmeshed with another person. So what does that psychological invasion look like on the narcissistic parent's part? So this means that they'll read your diary, they'll search your room, they'll look at your phone, they'll read your emails, they might read your snail mail, they will control you coercively, they'll use lots of techniques to dominate you. So it's about domination, power and control. So in terms of weapons, what defences does a child have in resisting being occupied? The defences we have are going to generally be submissive defences. We're going to go into freeze defences. Lots of people have panic disorders when they've grown up in this kind of environment. We're going to have quite submissive defences, which is that we're people-pleasing, we're a peacekeeper, a peacemaker. We're going to put our own needs last and the narcissistic parents' needs first. So in his book, The Rape of the Mind, page 120, he's talking about totalitaria. So we can use this as a metaphor for living in a country, living in life dominated by a narcissist. So in totalitaria, there is no faith in fellow men, no love, because real relationships between men do not exist, just as they do not exist between schizophrenics. So he's talking about schizophrenia in this chapter. There is only faith in and subjection to the feeding system, and there is in every citizen a tremendous fear of being expelled from that system, a fear of being totally lost, comparable with a schizophrenic's feeling of rejection and fear of reality. In the midst of spiritual loneliness and isolation, there is the fear of still greater loneliness and of more painful isolation. Without protective regulations from the outside, internal hell may break loose. Strong mechanical external order must be used to cover the internal chaos and approaching breakdown. And we have had experience in post-war years with several refugees from the totalitarian world who broke down when they had to cope with a world of freedom, where personal initiative was required. The fear of freedom brought them to a state of panic. They no longer had strong enough egos to build and maintain their defences against the competitive demands of free, democratic reality. As in schizophrenia, a manoeuvrable and individual ego cannot exist in totalitaria. Totalitaria requires of its citizens complete subjection to and identification with the leader. It is this leader dominance that makes people nearly egoless as they are in schizophrenia. This again may result in loss of control of hostile and destructive drives. Psychologists have seen this time and time again in what we call the concentration camp psyche. When the victims first came to the camp, dedicated to their gradual extermination, most of them displayed a complete loss of self and utter depersonalization, combined with apathy and loss of awareness. And the same observations have been made among our prisoners of war in Korea. Some concentration camp victims got better immediately after their return to a normal society, and in others, this schizophrenic reaction of lost ego remained and, as we mentioned above, sometimes developed into a real psychosis. So this is really interesting, isn't it? Because we can see themes of this in the way it affects people when they grow up in a narcissistic family. So there's a fear of reality, which there can be because defenses like denial, minimization, and rationalization exist for children of narcissists. And there can often be feelings of depersonalization, which is feeling like the self isn't real, and derealization, which is feeling that our surroundings aren't real. So these things can be common for children of narcissists. So it might not be something you feel all the time, but it's something that can come and go. So on page 121, we have the book talking about fear of betrayal. In Totalitaria, each citizen is continually watched. So this is exactly what it's like in a narcissistic family, isn't it? There's no privacy, there's no respect for your space. You're being watched, you're being spied on by siblings because there's no trust there. There's no loyalty between any of the members of the family. It's dominated by the leader narcissistic parent. If both of your parents are narcissistic, you're going to have one that's more dominant than the other one. So you have adherence to that leader, and then all of the others are being played and controlled, divided and ruled. The mythical state moulds the individual's conscience. He has hardly any of his own. His neighbours watch him, his postman, his children, and they all represent the punishing state, just as he himself must represent the state and watch others, and not betraying them is a crime. The need to find conspiracies to discover persecutors and criminals is another schizophrenic manifestation. It is psychologically related to an infantile need for a feeling of omnipotence. Megalomaniac feelings grow better in an atmosphere of mysterious secrecy. So that's really interesting, isn't it? That not betraying other people is a crime. So it's 100% allegiance to the totalitarian state. It's 100% allegiance to the narcissistic parent, or there'll be trouble. The deep hate the sick individual feels towards a parental figure cannot be expressed directly, and so it is displaced onto the self or onto scapegoats. Scapegoatism is also part of the totalitarian strategy. As we have pointed out before, the scapegoat temporarily absorbs all the individual's inner fury and rage. Kulaks, Negroes, Jews, communists, capitalists, profiteers and warmongers, any or all of them can play that role. Perhaps the greatest dangers to the totalitarian mind is the use of intellect and awareness and the egghead's demand for free, verifying thinking. Aberration and perversion are chosen by the citizens of Totalitaria as they are by the inhabitants of madhouses over tiring intellectual control. In the centre of the totalitarian fears and fantasies stands the man-eating god and idol. He is unconquerable. He uses man's great gift of adjustment to bring him to slavery, and every man's inner core of feelings and thoughts has to belong to the leader. Is the citizen of Totalitaria consciously aware of this? Probably not. Modern psychology has taught us how strongly the mental mechanism of denial of reality works. The eye bypasses external occurrences when the mind does not want them to happen. Secondary justifications and fantasies are formed to support and explain these denials. In Totalitaria, we find the same despising of reality facts as we do in schizophrenia. So if we change the word schizophrenia there for in people with complex PTSD, we're going to find a lesser version of that in people from a narcissistic household. And exactly that. There's so much denial, and there's the fragmentation of the mind as well, as it develops lots of different types of coping mechanisms, lots of different defenses. So very similar, really interesting. 125. When once a nation is under the yoke of totalitarianism, when once its people have succumbed to the oversimplifications and blandishments of the would-be dictator, how does the leader maintain his power? What techniques does he use to make his countrymen docile followers of his bloody regime? Because man's mature self resists totalitarianism, the dictator must work and scheme constantly to keep his subjects in line and to immobilize their need for individual development, rebellion, and healthy growth. This is exactly what happens in a narcissistic family. As we examine his techniques, we will come to a better understanding of totalitarianism and of the interaction between the dictator's methods and the personalities of his subjects. We need this understanding desperately, for we have to recognize that the forces in Totalitaria that make humorless robots out of living men can also develop, albeit unwittingly, in the so-called free democratic societies. The weapon of terror has been used by tyrants from time immemorial to make a meek instrument of man. In Totalitaria, the use of this weapon is refined to a science which can wipe out all opposition and dissent. The leaders of Totalitaria rule by intimidation. They prefer loyalty through fear to loyalty through faith. Fear and terror freeze the mind and will, and they may create a general psychic paralysis. In the panic caused by totalitarian terror, men feel separated from one another as by an impassable vacuum, and each man becomes a lonely, frightened soul. Even panicky hovering together could be suspected of being conspiracy against the state. Separated from any real emotional contact with his fellow men by his own inner isolation, the citizen of Totalitaria becomes increasingly unable to fight against its dehumanizing influences. Totalitaria is constantly on the alert for social sinners, the critics of the system, and accusation of dissent is equivalent to conviction in the public eye. Insinuation, calumny, and denunciation are staples of the totalitarian strategy. The entire nation is dedicated to the proposition that every man is a potential enemy of the regime. No one is excluded from the terror, and any man may be subjected to it no matter how low his rank. And as it says there, they prefer loyalty through fear. So how do you prove your loyalty to the regime, to the narcissistic parent? So you're going to go along with colluding with abusing the scapegoat, for example. You're going to go along with everything that the narcissistic parent says, support their beliefs, admire them, boost their ego, feed their ego with narcissistic supply, all the things that they require. And even the scapegoat will collude with the narcissistic parent in this way at times, or all of the children will. And we can see this in the way that we betray ourselves in order to pacify and please the narcissistic parent. So there's nothing a narcissistic parent likes more than when their child has a self-deprecating sense of humour. So they put themselves down, they belittle themselves, they make jokes about how stupid they are, how clumsy they are, all these kind of things. And this is a way to prove loyalty in a way, isn't it? And we can be angry with these parts of ourselves as well and not like these parts of ourselves, because it's like we're betraying ourselves, we're traitors. In Totalitaria, the air is full of gossip, calumny and rumour. Any accusation, even if it is false, has a greater influence on the citizenry than subsequent vindication. The more fear there is in a society, the more guilt each individual member of the society feels, the more need there is to look for internal scapegoats and external enemies. Internal confusion looks for discharge in outside wars. So that's really interesting, isn't it? So we're looking to project that feeling, to discharge that feeling out of us onto outsiders, scapegoats. So there's dehumanizing in here as well, the dehumanizing of others and the dehumanizing of the scapegoat. There can be feelings of the citizenry and feelings in the narcissistic family that rather someone else than me can be a feeling that some people have, and they go along with the regime. Other people will fight the regime. They'll fight to protect their siblings. They will distract the attention onto them and they'll take the punishment rather than a sibling taking it. People can be very protective. So it's not always a bleak place of betrayal. It can be in some families, but every family is different. Accusations against others remind him of his own inner rebellions and hostilities, which he does not dare to bring out into the open. And so the accused, even when he is innocent, becomes the scapegoat for his own private sense of guilt. Cowardice makes the other citizens of our mythical country turn away from the victim, lest they be accused themselves. Isn't that interesting? The very fact that character assassination is possible reveals the frailty and sensitivity of human sympathy and empathy. Even in free democratic societies, political campaigns are often conducted in an atmosphere of extravagant accusation and even wilder counter-accusation. The moment the strategy of wild accusation with all its disagreeable noises of vituperation and calumny begins, we forget the strategic intention behind the words and find ourselves influenced by the shouting and the name-calling. Maybe we say to ourselves, there is something in this story. This, of course, is just what the slanderer wants. In the minds of the politicians, the illusion still persists that the end justifies the means. But campaigns of slander produce paradoxical results because the very fact that an unfounded accusation has been made weakens the moral sense of both listener and accuser. So we're familiar with this in the world of narcissism, aren't we? So this is a smear campaign. Situations and words are taken out of context. They're invented even. There are lies told about their children, their scapegoat children, the golden children. People do believe it. People outside of the family do believe them. And a lot of the time, the scapegoat finds themselves being given a wide berth by other members of the family or by neighbours or by friends of the narcissistic parents, for example, because of the whispers of a smear campaign. So things like, Brian's mental health is really bad. I think he's a bit crazy. Do you know what he said to me the other day? And of course, everything's out of context and the narcissist presents themselves as the victim of the situation and the scapegoat as the persecutor. And this is one of the most unfair things, is that the narcissistic parents use smear campaigns to undermine their children's reputations and their integrity. So as well, this serves the purpose of everyone using that scapegoat as a scapegoat, and also that if that scapegoat speaks out, then in that other person's mind, there's already doubt there cast about their mental stability, their mental health, who they are as a person. So then it's going to be difficult for that person to be believed by anyone if they came out and spoke the truth. The more the individual feels himself to be part of the group, the more easily he can become the victim of mass suggestion. This is why primitive communities, which have a high degree of social integration and identification, are so sensitive to suggestions. Sorcerers and magicians can often keep an entire tribe under their spell. Most crowds are rather easy to influence and hypnotize because common longings and yearnings increase the suggestibility of each member of the group. Each person has a tendency to identify with the rest of the group and with the leader as well, and this makes it easy for the leader to hold the people in his grip. As Hitler said in Mein Kampf, the leader can count on increasing submissiveness from the masses. So this is really interesting, that yearning to belong. So we can have parts of our defences which are known as the attached defences. If we look at the system of mammalian defences, which are fight, flight, freeze, submit and attach. So we want to attach to other people. So we want to attach to the narcissistic parent because we have a longing to be accepted, to be loved, to belong to the group. So this is innate in humans as social beings and innate in children who really need to be able to attach to that parent, even if the parent is abusive. So this is why a narcissist holds such power over their children. And then it becomes ingrained, and then our responses to their behaviours are part of our survival strategies, which we end up trapped in to a certain extent until we can develop some self-awareness, do some self-development, learn about this stuff, look into narcissism, and then get a better understanding of what happened. And then we can start to recover from it when we have more of a sense of reality. The demagogue himself is almost incapable of humour of any sort. And if we treat him with humour, he will begin to collapse. So this is really interesting, isn't it? Because most narcissists, they're not very witty, or they don't have a good sense of humour. They tend to like humour that's about putting other people down, mocking other people. When their children are self-deprecating, they find that funny. I think they're quite well known for their lack of a sense of humour, aren't they? Humour is, after all, related to a sense of perspective. If we can see how things should be, we can see how askew they can get, and we can recognise distortion when we are confronted with it. Put the demagogue's statements in perspective and you'll see how utterly distorted they are. How can we possibly take them seriously or answer them seriously? The demagogue relies on his effectiveness on the fact that people will take seriously the fantastic accusations he makes, will discuss the phony issues he raises as if they had reality, or will be thrown into such a state of panic by his accusations and charges that they will simply abdicate their right to think and verify for themselves. So this is absolutely what happens in a narcissistic family. The fact is that the demagogue is not appealing to what is rational and mature in man. He is appealing to what is most irrational and most immature. To attempt to answer his ravings with logic is to attempt the impossible. First of all, by doing so, we accept his battling premises and we find ourselves trapped in an argument on terms he has chosen. It is always easier to defeat an enemy on your own ground and by choosing your own terms. In addition, the demagogue either is or pretends to be incapable of the kind of logic that makes discussion and clarification possible. He is master at changing the subject. It is worse than criminal for us to get involved in endless, pointless, and inevitably vituperative arguments with men who are less concerned with truth, social good, and real problems than they are with gaining unlimited attention and power for themselves. Well, this is it exactly. So this is often why we can end up having a habit of over-explaining ourselves because of that very situation. The narcissist is trying to control and to twist reality, and we are trying to come from a place of logic where we're defending ourselves. No, that didn't happen. No, I didn't do that. And we can become caught up in this. So if I can explain myself properly, then they're going to understand me. You know, a misunderstanding has happened. But what we don't know as children, or maybe we do know on some level, but we push it into our subconscious, is that misunderstanding is deliberate because they want power and dominance. So naturally, a narcissistic parent has power in terms of they have all the money, they have the house that you live in, they don't respect your privacy, so they're going to go through your diary, they're going to imagine what you think and then punish you for things that you think even. This is something that's very common. And then they have a mental list of the things that you've done wrong in their mind, which they can reel off. They memorize and reel off at any given point to put you on the back foot, and they repeat this. So then they're instilling a sense of shame in you because they're telling you what a bad person you are by bringing up all these old transgressions that you've done 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There's no time limit. This is interesting. So this talks about the fainting pattern of defense. So people that have a lot of freeze defenses tend to have a panic disorders, anxiety disorders, social anxiety, that kind of thing, where we go into panic. And in this section of the book, he's going to talk about this. Actual psychology looks at both reactions, feigning and fainting, as a passive retreat from reality. This reaction is comparable to shell shock or battle neurosis, the study of which is one of the most absorbing chapters of medicine. Soldier and civilian alike can go into a state of mental paralysis. In such a state, the victim becomes apathetic. He is unable to talk or move. No dangerous reality exists for him anymore. He looks dead. Only his frightened, burning eyes seem alive. This death attitude or cataleptic reaction often has a completely terrifying effect on bystanders. There is nothing so contagious as fainting in any crowded place. It is of the utmost importance to realise how passive, paralysed, indifferent and submissive people can become under circumstances which should demand the utmost activity. The totalitarians are making use of man's passive reaction to terror when they put their prisoners into huge concentration camps with only a few guards. They are gambling that the reaction of passivity will keep the victim from rebelling or trying to escape. Like the bird which stands stock still when the snake approaches, man may surrender passively to what he dreads and fears in order to get rid of the tension of anticipation. The thief who surrenders to the police because he cannot stand the tension and insecurity of not knowing when he will be found out is an obvious example. In times of stress and calamity, people begin to probe for the vulnerable spots and weaknesses in both their friends and their enemies. This testing goes on constantly during a hot war, but it also happens during a cold war as well. The Cold War exerts a continual pressure on human imagination and mental fortitude and is the cause of many peculiar escape reactions or bodily reactions. Whenever fear and danger confront him, man has to make a choice. Shall he indulge in unchecked fury? Shall he concentrate upon self-protection? Or shall he accept his responsibilities? The fear reactions we have described show how the primordial impulse to self-protection, misguided though it may be, can break through all our civilized defenses. Only training and conscious preparation for danger, both inner and outer, can give a man strength to hold these reactions in check. This training starts within the nucleus of the family and is supported by the example of a peaceful, free community. These are the first teachers in the constant battle between inner fear and outer danger. So in a narcissistic family then, we're probably going to be lacking in this. There may be some helpful adult figures around, but there isn't this help to build a strong sense of self and a strong sense of inner resilience. Conditioning a child into a servile and submissive attitude, for example, may start when parents rigidly imprint automatic rules of conduct on the infant. They may make a time maniac out of him or a cleaning automaton. They may compel him to speak too early or to be silent when his voice itches to burst out of his throat, or to sleep when his body is throbbing with the energy of wakefulness. Such parents impose on their child a constant feeling of guilt. He feels disturbed and unhappy every time he does not comply with their demands, and at the same time they force him to love them even when they are disagreeable. They may compel him to apologize for behavior which seems to him to be perfectly acceptable, and they may demand that he confess to crimes which do not exist as crimes for him at his age. Some techniques of brainwashing can be seen at the cradle. The parents may cross-examine him, tie him to their apron strings, or keep him constantly under their eyes. With their solicitous attention, they never leave him alone to enjoy the feeling of being secure with himself. The helpless child in such an environment becomes emotionally insecure. In exchange for more borrowed security, he becomes more conforming and submissive, although this conforming behaviour covers up tremendous inner protest and hostility. When parents do not permit a child to express his instinctual needs openly and directly, they force him to look for other ways to express them. If during his early training, which may start on the day of his birth, the infant encounters endless restrictions to the direct expression of his needs, he will try to communicate these needs in indirect ways through tension, restlessness and crying. Instead of being able to use natural outlets for his instinctual drives, the child is permitted and conditioned to act only through suppression and control of the drive. In his struggle to bring the drive under control in order to please his parents, the child's natural means of expression may become inverted. Instead of expression, he acquires repression. This is where the roots of such adult behaviour as abject submissiveness and the urge for conformity lie. The groundwork for this masochistic pattern of giving in is formed in infancy. Submission and confession are the only strategies possible for the child in a world that is too overpowering for him to handle. Inner rebellion, hostility and hatred must be expressed in a paradoxical way. The child's rigid silence is proof that he wants to cry and yell. He may reproach and attack the hostile world indirectly through magic gestures, clownish behaviour, or even epileptic fits. Compelled to suppress his instinctual needs and his means of achieving their gratification, he may conceal their existence even from himself. Surface conformity becomes his only means of communication, and when this happens, words and gestures acquire a concealing function. He never says what he means, and gradually he doesn't even know what he means. The carryovers into adult life of this kind of child rearing are obvious. Trained into conformity, the child may well grow up into an adult who welcomes with relief the authoritarian demands of a totalitarian leader. It is the welcome repetition of an old pattern that can be followed without investment of new emotional energy. Trained previously to divert his aggression to scapegoats, he may now displace his hidden resentments against his parents' rules and regulations towards society as a whole, or he may find release for them in the wild explosion of pent-up aggression which is exemplified by the lynch mob or by Hitler's stormtroopers. So this is so interesting, and this is what James Masterson talks about as well. He was an expert in narcissistic personality disorder. He talks about how we are stifled and trained into conformity with the narcissist rules, so we suppress our own needs and wants, and if we ever get a feeling of what our wants and needs are and they're trying to exert themselves, we're often overcome with strong feelings of guilt which suppress those feelings then, because guilt is a feeling of I'm doing something wrong. And then this is why we end up with narcissistic partners often, not always, but often, or partners that are controlling when we've come from that kind of background because of what he's speaking about here. You're trained into conformity, which means when somebody who's controlling comes along, it can feel comfortable. You know it, you're used to it, you're familiar with it, and then you can cling to those kind of people. And that's what the trauma bond is as well. The earliest web of communication between parents and child takes place on what psychology calls a pre-verbal and unconscious level. There is contact without words. The mother transfers her mood directly to the child. He senses and catches her feelings. The child also transfers his moods to her. She feels his pains and joys almost as soon as he does. This sensitivity of the infant makes him react with great intensity. He is profoundly aware of his parents' feelings. Such negative parental factors as anxiety, insecurity, infantilism, mutual disharmony, neurotic love, poverty, the struggle for existence, and compulsive tyranny have an enormous effect on the child. Not long ago, I trained an infant who refused any offer of handling or feeding by its mother. The infant knew that the mother had a deep-seated hostility against it. It felt her aversion and rejection. But the infant accepted food and affection from everyone else. This interplay between parental attitudes and child development starts at birth. Then on page 189, he talks about having a weak father figure. When there is no father figure, or if the father is too weak or too busy or is denying and tyrannical towards the child, the result is that the child's relationship with and dependence on the mother remains strong and lasts too long. Consequently, the child's need for social participation and for gregarious ties with others may become to him a consuming need. As an adult, he may be willing to join any social group which promises him support and reassurance. Or his unconscious resentment against the father who did not help him to grow up and become independent may be diverted into a resentment against other symbols of authority, such as society itself. Either way, the child may be headed for maladjustment and for difficulties, and either way, the child may grow up into an immature adult. This chapter is called The Turncoat in Each of Us, so I think it's really interesting to think of this in terms of how it can happen on a societal level, and then also how this can happen within the internal landscape of our war-torn minds when we've come from a narcissistic background. Rejection of the norms and rules of the community, being one's own judge of morality and ethics, is often considered treasonable. And this is what can happen in a narcissistic family if you go against the rules and the norms of that cult. Then this is seen as treason, as betrayal by the narcissistic parent, and justification for your punishment, your banishment. Utter rejection of the traditions of one's fatherland is an extreme. Often simple nonconformity may be considered treasonable too. Indeed, in Totalitaria, nonconformity and dissent are the most serious crimes against the system, and totalitarian minds have a tendency to look upon even honest mistakes or differences of opinion as deliberate treachery. The germ of treason arises first in the individual's compromises with his own principles and beliefs. So it's really interesting to think that as part of our coping mechanisms, when we've come from a narcissistic family, we're going to have those parts of us that betray ourselves and side with the narcissist. So we can see this in self-deprecating humour. We can see this in the way that some of us can be quite consciously aware of giving ammo to the narcissistic parent, which can be used against them. Or we're doing it subconsciously, but it's a way of, it's quite a masochistic way of getting acceptance or attention, or feeling like there's some kind of love there, is that we tell a narcissist something intimate about ourselves, about a conversation that we've had, about something that's happened, about something really personal, and then that can be used against you, or it can be told to other people and used to undermine you, embarrass you, humiliate you. So sometimes we are betraying ourselves, and then we can have an internal conflict about that and a dislike for ourselves for doing those things, but we're trying to survive. So on page 241, he's writing about Hitler, and he says, Hitler knew too that unlimited political terror could make a traitor of almost anyone. So if we think about the terror and the fear that it is to be the target of narcissistic rage when you're a small child, it's bad enough when you're an adult. So when you're a small child, that terror can make you betray yourself. Spread fear, terror and hunger, inflict penetrating pain, and finally, as a result of mental coercion and growing confusion, many will succumb and even betray their own families. In many of the concentration camps, the victims themselves were in charge of the gas chamber killings and kept their gruesome jobs until their own turns came. Fear and terror had made will-less slaves out of them. Then on page 243, he talks about an act of self-betrayal may begin as a defence against the feeling of being lost and rejected. In order to win acceptance in a group, the individual may hide and not defend his private beliefs and convictions when attacked. In psychology, this may be called, if such passive behaviour becomes an unconscious habit, the passive submission to and identification with the stronger person. If you cannot beat the enemy, join him. So we're going to perhaps have a strong sense of this as children, and even as adults if we're in those same coping mechanisms and we haven't yet managed to break out of them or heal from what's happening. Although the concept of the inner traitor in us is not so easy to accept, by studying the contrasting inner drives that lead man, one becomes more convinced of that possibility. The clinical concept of man's inner ambivalence is based on numerous psychological experiences. In studying the deeper motivations of many a traitor, we often see that his treacherous act happened after an inner turmoil threatened to break him down, to make an uncontrolled nervous wreck out of him. It is as if the future mental patient preferred to surrender to an outward enemy rather to the inward enemies of disease and nervous breakdown. So as survivors of narcissistic families, we're going to be trying to balance ourselves in terms of trying not to be overwhelmed by any feelings that we've repressed. We're trying to manage ourselves. We might manage ourselves through addictions. Generally, we're going to manage ourselves in an unhealthy way until we've healed from the experiences that we've been through. So in trying to stabilize ourselves and our mind and not to feel like we're going to collapse or break down, then we are sometimes going to betray ourselves. This is page 279, chapter 17, From Old to New Courage. Who resists longer and why? What then can give a man strength to resist a menticidal assault? What made it possible for so many thousands to survive mentally and physically the horrors of the Nazi concentration camps and the communist prisoner of war camps? The answer is essentially simple. Men yield primarily because at some point they are overwhelmed by their unconscious conflicts. These conflicts, kept under control in normal circumstances, come to the surface under the strain of menticidal pressure. The stronger the inner conflicts and the greater the pressure, the greater the tendency to yield. Men withstand pressure when these conflicts cannot be so easily aroused or have been inwardly overcome. This simple answer itself contains a clinical paradox. One of the characteristics of severe neurosis and of some cases of pathological character structure is that unconscious conflicts are so severe that they are either repressed so deeply that the sufferer is not even vaguely aware of their existence, or they are transformed into a set of overt attitudes which are more acceptable to the individual and therefore easier to handle. If the severe neurotic permitted himself to feel his real conflicts, they would dominate his life completely. Consequently, he exerts tremendous force to hold down this explosive material. The man who is always rebellious, never growing from healthy rebellion into healthy maturity, may have transformed some basic and profound conflict in his own personality into a chronic resistance against any kind of social demand. Psychiatric examination of returned prisoners of war from Korea showed that many of these men who resisted enemy propaganda most strongly were those with a history of lifelong rebellion against all authority, from parents through teachers to army superiors. They were troublemakers wherever they were, among their friends as well as among their enemies. The negative side of this coin is only part of the picture. A man with deep self-knowledge, aware of his own inner conflicts and aware too of what the enemy is trying to do to him, is prepared to meet and resist the attack. So this is where know your enemy is so important. If you understand the narcissist and why they do the things they do, then you can predict their behaviours better. And then you can defend yourself against them more easily. The more consciously aware you are of yourself, the more in control of yourself you are, the more realistic your view of reality is and your view of life and other people is. And this can be the greatest strength that you can have. Chapter 18, page 294, Freedom, Our Mental Backbone. The totalitarian state is continually driving out man's private opinions and convictions. And for the police state, thinking is already acting. So for many people with narcissistic parents, their narcissistic parent will tell them what they're thinking and punish them for it as well. And then he's talking about not conforming to Totalitaria is an act of high treason, which is how it's seen in a narcissistic family. The man who fails to achieve freedom knows only two extremes: unquestioning submission and impulsive rebellion. So this is the position that many of children of narcissists find themselves in. So we have our submissive defences, which we utilise a lot in a narcissistic family, and then that rebelling against them. So that would be our fight defences, when we want to rebel and escape that control, because we always have that desire to be ourselves in us that actually we have to repress and fight against on a daily basis. So an inner conflict, so that part of ourselves that wants to grow, which is our true self, and then our defenses which want to protect us against that happening, because we live in totalitaria. So how do we achieve freedom? We do this by freeing our mind, recognizing our defenses, and then putting healthier ones in place, more mature ones in place that we live in, rather than living in those defenses that have been mostly constructed in early childhood and teenage years. So this book's really interesting. So for me, it's that looking at the macrocosm and the microcosm. So this is the macrocosm in society, how totalitarian governments can function and how the people are submissive and controlled by them. And then how that happens on an individual level as well, in a family which is headed by a narcissist. And then also there are elements in our own mind on an individual level. We are like the different citizens of totalitaria. Parts of us betray ourselves, parts of us are submissive, parts of us are rebellious. We're all kinds of things when we have a war-torn landscape, to use the countries at war analogy. That's psychological warfare. We have that war-torn landscape of a mind, and we're trying to recover from living in a totalitarian society, living in a cult. It can be comparable to a cult as well. That feeling of, if you leave the cult, it's treason, it's dissent, it's punishable by shunning, it's punishable by being disowned. And these are common things which happen, as we all know, when we come from a narcissistic family. It's my way or the highway, because it's absolutely treason to not go along with the narcissistic parent and their rules and their ideas, and the giving them narcissistic supply, and also the worship of their grandiose image of themselves, that idealized image of themselves. And good to know these things, because it gives us a better understanding of ourselves, the families we come from, society as a whole, the world as a whole, and the patterns that ebb and flow. So many people are familiar with the idea of boundaries, but it's interesting to look in depth at what actually causes that lack of boundaries. And it's the psychological warfare, the behavioural conditioning, the emotional warfare, the dysfunctional upbringing, the emotional neglect, however you want to term it. It's growing up in that kind of environment with a narcissistic family that results in us not having boundaries or not being aware of having boundaries. So this is one of the most difficult things to repair. And when we are healthy, when we're more healed, is when we can start to be able to set boundaries. So don't be too hard on yourself if you struggle with it, or if you find that you can't do it. And it might take a while until you do feel comfortable enough to be able to do that. Because what has to happen is your relationship with yourself has to change first, so that you really want to set those boundaries. And then that will to assert yourself is going to overrule any fear that would cause you to not want to set the boundaries. And the fear of setting boundaries is from fears of punishments, reprisals, silent treatments, rages, and also, most importantly, the fear of abandonment and the fear of rejection. So this is going to be really prevalent. So we've got this deep ingrained conditioning that if we do set boundaries and if we do put our wants and needs as priority, then we're going to be abandoned and rejected. So we need to be aware that these are really deep-rooted reasons why we struggle to set boundaries. So as we heal from coming from a family like this, then boundaries do tend to be still a struggle to set, but when we're more in touch with ourselves and more in touch with those feelings that our body feels when our boundaries are being pushed. So someone's standing too close to us, we might get an uncomfortable feeling and an urge to pull away. Or if we're on the phone to somebody who stays on the phone for a long time, and then we feel like we can't tell them that we want to get off the phone because we fear rejection. This is ingrained in us. So we might not even think like that, but we just feel a pressure to stay on the phone, or a passivity. Oh, we're staying on the phone until they say to us, oh, I'm going now off the phone. We might have a feeling of an uncomfortableness or an irritability or a feeling of I want to get off the phone, but feeling trapped there that you can't because there's a disconnect between I could actually say I'm going off the phone now because we've suppressed that need to put our boundaries there. So as we heal, we get more in touch with our wants and needs, and the will to assert them does get stronger, and the fear to not assert them gets weaker, and our relationship with ourselves changes. So we think, actually, I value my time. We're not going to think it like this, but something like, I value my time and I don't want to spend 4 hours on the phone to Uncle Brian because I've got other things I want to be doing. All these things take a lot of time, so be gentle with yourself. So how do we heal? A lot of it is developing self-awareness. So noticing what's going on in our bodies, noticing our irritability, and then being curious about it and wondering why. Because there's a reason for every feeling that we have. And it's good to know what healthy boundaries look like, as I talked about at the beginning of the video. So then we have an idea of what to aim for and where a healthy place to be is. And that self-awareness as well helps us to learn more about our war-torn landscape so we can get to know it and rebuild that, get a strong sense of self. And then when we have a strong sense of self, then we're going to be able to have a strong boundary that no other country can invade. And that's when we're a more balanced person and we're putting our needs and wants at equal importance with other people, and more important than certain toxic kinds of people. So gives us all a better understanding of what's going on. So I hope that was interesting. This is going to have been a really long video, so I expect hardly anyone still watching. But if you are, thank you, and take care of yourself. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Bye.